As was mentioned, The Innovator's Manifesto is my third book, a second on innovation, and it really is part of an ongoing body of work that attempts to apply disruption theory, which is a particular way of thinking about innovation, to a variety of different contexts. And so my hope is that I'll take a few minutes this morning, probably no more than about 20, and give you a few ideas about how I think some of these concepts might be applicable to questions in the public sector generally and in healthcare in particular. So, structuring markets for predictable innovation. I think I'd like to start, in fact, I know I'd like to start because it's my first slide. I'd like to start by saying a few words about how I've come to think about innovation as a particular construct. It's one of those terms. It's kind of like total quality in the 80s. It's kind of like re-engineering in the 90s. It's, you name it, there's always kind of a buzzword that seems almost to be emptied of all substantive meaning simply by dint of repetition and application to such a wide variety of contexts that we really don't know what we're talking about anymore. So I'm not going to suggest that somehow this is the right or the only way to think about innovation, but I do want to suggest that it's proved to be a very useful way of sort of drawing some boundary lines around what we're talking about. And to illustrate how I've come to think about innovation, I want to talk about an entirely different industry for a couple of minutes, and that's the mobile handset market. Now, Motorola ruled the mobile handset market for a decade or more, right? These are two of their more popular devices. The one on the, I guess on your right, that was the old StarTAC. Anybody here remember the StarTAC? Anybody here have a StarTAC at some point? I mean, they were enormous status symbols, right? I mean, it's easy to forget, but the StarTAC was $3,200 at retail back in 1992. Back in the day when it was $1 a minute for connect time. So these are very expensive devices. I guess their last big hit was probably the Razr phone that came out in the late 90s. And if you want to think about how Motorola was successful in that market over time, I'm going to import wholesale here a framework for thinking about competitive differentiation from Michael Porter in the World of Industrial Organization Economics. We've got here a two-space, right? We've got cost on the vertical axis. It's an inverted scale, higher on the bottom, lower on the top, so costs decrease as you move up, and differentiation from left to right. And if you think about all the different combinations of cost and performance that are possible at any given point in time, collectively they form what we'll call the production possibility frontier. It captures the limit of what we can achieve given the state of human understanding at a point in time. Because after all, we are subject to constraints. There's only so much performance that can be delivered at a given cost at a point in time. And when you think about Motorola's position in the mobile handset space for that decade of the 90s, call it, it's pretty clear that they had a highly differentiated position. They sat down there at the extreme, at the low end, with a highly differentiated but very high-cost product that delivered just the right bundle of value to a sufficient number of consumers who are willing to pay, that they had a highly successful proposition. So good for them. But nothing lasts forever, right? Trees don't grow to the sky, and Motorola found itself actually in a bit of competitive trouble over the years. It ended up getting flanked by RIM, our good friends up the 401 in Waterloo, and at the low-cost end, they got flanked by Nokia, right? So RIM had a more differentiated proposition with the BlackBerry and the BlackBerry Enterprise Server and highly robust physical devices and secure data transmission, and Nokia with its globalized integrated supply chain was the lowest cost, and I think in many ways remains the lowest cost manufacturer of handsets in the world. Motorola had in some sense fallen off the production possibility frontier, and so as a consequence was no longer competitive, was no longer enjoying the success that it once had. Now, as it has adopted the Android operating system and has been acquired by Google of late, it's found its way back onto the frontier. It's now once again a competitive player in the mobile handset space, but I'd suggest it doesn't have a particularly differentiated position. It's basically in a bar fight. There's a bit too much gain on the microphone. Everyone okay? It's just really echoing up here. Yeah, you okay? Fine. It's about you, so they're back on the frontier, and they're competing with the other Android handset makers, HTC, Samsung, Sony Ericsson, et cetera, right? So, of course, whom haven't I mentioned? Apple, of course. So where do we put Apple on this particular diagram? Where on the frontier would you put Apple? Highly differentiated? Yeah, highly different. That's certainly a defensible position. I'd almost think about it a little differently, though. I want to suggest that part of the reason Apple has been so successful is not because it has so much a different position on the same frontier, but it has pushed the frontier. Full marks, right here. Turn on this man's mic. He's got good things to say. So yes, it's pushed the frontier, right? They are out there at a point in cost-performance space that nobody else can get to, right? If you go onto RIM's website and you send in a note to their tech support people and you say, how much would I have to pay you to get a BlackBerry that had 500,000 apps available for it? And the answer would be, there isn't one, There is no price that you could pay to get a level of performance that Apple is able to deliver. They have expanded the frontier. So what that gives me is a way of thinking about three terms that are used with somewhat conceptual abandon, and think about them in a slightly more precise way. Operations, for me, is about optimizing within constraints. It's about getting to the frontier of what's possible. All right, Mr. Hammergan was talking about that earlier. You know, we can barcode potato chips. Why can't we barcode pharmaceuticals? There's something to be said for simply getting to the frontier of what is operationally possible in a particular market. And you know what? There's real merit in that. You generate genuine value as a consequence of doing it. But it's not innovation yet. It's operational excellence. It's worth doing. And the good news is we know how to do this, right? Toyota Production System, Six Sigma, lean manufacturing, you name it. There is a well-developed set of tools, change management, organizational redesign. There's a lot of things that we know how to do in order to make this happen, provided that we know what it is we're trying to do. So if we're simply trying to get to the frontier of the possible, there's a toolkit we can pick up and make that happen. Now, in competitive markets, strategy is, for me now, about choosing your constraints. Where on the frontier do you want to live? Do you want to be highly differentiated? Do you want to be a cost leader? Right? How are you going to win the battle for the hearts and minds of customers in a competitive marketplace? So strategy is about where on that frontier. But now innovation is about breaking constraints. Innovation is about establishing a new frontier. With apologies to Gene Roddenberry, it's about boldly going where no one's gone before. Right? So operations, that's a solved problem. Strategic differentiation, we have a pretty well-developed set of tools for addressing that. But when it comes to innovation, innovation's a different kettle of fish. And we don't have nearly as well-developed a set of tools for developing and implementing innovation successfully. Now, if innovation is about breaking constraints, right, moving beyond the established frontier into the white space, I want to ask the question, what kind of innovation is particularly valuable, right? So I want to give you a quick example here from the history of the automotive business. And back in 1920, the cheapest automobile available was a Ford Model T. It cost $3,200 in today's money and had 20 horsepower, slightly less than many riding lawnmowers. The fastest automobile of the day was a Bugatti Type 35, cost $180,000 and had 140 horsepower. That's less than many minivans. But we can graph these things, right? We have performance on the horizontal, total horsepower. We have cost per unit of performance in an inverted scale on the vertical axis. And we can plot these two automobiles. There's the Model T, there's the Bugatti, there's the frontier between them. Now, we have innovated in the last 91 years with respect to 92 years with respect to automobiles, right? We've got now the cheapest automobile is the Tata Nano, $2,100 and 33 horsepower. And the fastest automobile, if you can believe it, is still a Bugatti. 1.9 million for 987 horse. That's the base model, by the way. I should point that out. I have one of these, as it turns out. It's about this big, and it sits on my book. But buy the book, and maybe I'll trade up. And so what you see here is two very different ways of thinking about innovation. We have the Tata Nano, which I find tremendously inspiring because it gives us more for less. And then you've got the Bugatti, which is basically just more for more. More total horsepower, but you've got to pay more for every one of them. Two very different types of innovation and two very different value propositions associated with each. Now, what I've tended to observe is that in many markets, and I'm not speaking here of the public sector or healthcare in particular, but in many markets, the type of innovation that most organizations seem designed to pursue is the kind of innovation that delivers more for more. Right? It's the same organization that managed to push that green dot down and to the right. It's a completely different organization in a completely different part of the world that managed to move that blue dot straight up. Right? Now, the most valuable innovation is the kind that gives more for less. And so there's an interesting problem, which is how do you do that? Right? You can see why we're trying to build the argument here. Innovation is about breaking constraints, expanding the frontier. We want to expand the frontier in a particular way. We won't want to deliver more for more. We want to deliver more for less. And if that's what we're after, well, what's the best way to do that? And that's where disruption comes in. Disruption, I think, is a particularly effective way of breaking trade-offs in the manner that I've described. And to give an example, I want to talk about Southwest. Now, first, a quick question. Many of you are observers of the general business scene, and how many of you are sick to death of hearing about Southwest? I hope it's everybody, right, because it gets done to death. But I want to suggest that I'm going to tell you something you haven't heard about Southwest before. And the way I think about Southwest goes something like this. The orthodoxy for this organization's success over time is built on its strategic differentiation. We're told that the reason they've been so successful is that they have a point-to-point route structure, no class of seating, they have no advanced seating, they've got no meals on the planes, right? They do all these things, fast turnarounds, 15-minute turnaround on the ground, keep the planes in the air. They do all these things, a very interdependent set of activities that allow them to deliver a very low-cost solution, and they're able to exploit that in low prices and growth and increase market share. That's the orthodoxy. I haven't told the whole story, but I don't think I've done too much violence to the truth. Here's the problem with that as an explanation. It doesn't exactly explain what we want to explain. This is a picture of Southwest's stock price from 1980 to 1990. It wouldn't be inappropriate, this is a healthcare conference, to reach for the defibrillator, right? There's not a lot going on with this equity value. And you want to ask yourself the question, why? Because during this decade, they were fabulously profitable. Their ROA was something in excess of 8% when the industry average was something less than 2%, right? Easily the most profitable airline in the United States, but a very low and uninspiring equity appreciation. Now, why might that be? Right? Remember your first year finance class, right? How is it that you can be fabulously profitable but have the equity value go nowhere? And the answer is no growth, right? This company was basically a bond. They had enormously productive assets, but you couldn't put more assets in use, so you couldn't increase the equity value of the firm. I want to suggest that Southwest did not have a low-cost position on the industry's established frontier. I want to suggest they built an entirely new frontier. They reached a point in cost-performance space that the rest of the airlines couldn't reach, but not in the way Apple did. Apple took that entire frontier and just blew the doors off. They reached a point in cost-performance space, but only across a very narrow sliver, a very narrow range of possible performance. And you can actually do the numbers and figure this out, right? Southwest had a ticket price between Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston back in the late 70s, $49 a seat, when Pan Am and Braniff couldn't push back from the gate for $49 a seat. Right? So this is an empirical fact. This isn't sort of hand-waving conjecture on my part. So they had reached this point in cost-performance space. They had broke the trade-offs, but only across a very narrow range of performance. And the reason they couldn't grow was because one of the key strategic choices they made is they had standardized on the 737-200. Now, the 300 came along, and it had even lower range. But the real constraint here about standardizing on the 737 is that it was an expensive plane to fly. It had a DOC per RPK, that's direct operating cost per revenue passenger kilometer disadvantage of 1.2 cents. What that means is that every time Southwest flies one passenger 1 kilometer, they give back 1.2 cents of the cost advantage they made up on the ground with their incredibly efficient ground operations. So as a consequence, they couldn't afford to fly very far. They could only fly routes of about 500 miles, and guess what that meant? In the continental US, that's not really a lot of coverage. So they ended up with a little cluster of routes in Texas, a little cluster of routes in California, another cluster out in the Midwest, and actually no way to fly in between them. They were a series of little pockets, little regional airlines disconnected from each other. No wonder they weren't growing. So what changed? Well, in 1990, this is what started to happen to their equity prices, and all of the media attention to Southwest began in about 1996, which is just after that first peak. So it just goes to show you that all the business academics out there are lagging indicators at best. And indeed, no one really called this. I can show you in a stock analyst report from November of 1989 that says Southwest is an interesting investment opportunity for people who enjoy a well-run organization in a niche market with limited opportunities for equity growth. That was 3 months before Southwest began a 10-year run that made it the most valuable equity in all of US equity markets, dot-com bubble included. I'm sure that's the only equity analyst to ever make a mistake like that. So what changed? Well, the strategy didn't, right? The strategy, this whole point-to-point thing and no classes of service, et cetera, that had been in place since 1972, but the growth didn't happen until 1990. Now, I'm a little old-fashioned. I don't like to explain things that change in terms of things that don't. So I had to look for something that changed. Now, over this period, the established airlines were busy shoving out the frontier of their existing set of activities, right? So lounges and frequent flyer miles and the various global alliances they put together and feeder networks and all that goes with it. Meanwhile, Southwest was exploiting the fact that the 737-500 finally showed up. And the 500 had a DOC per RPK disadvantage of less than half a cent. And as the slogan goes, they were now free to move about the country. Right? Now they could finally fly much longer routes. And if you look at the evolution of their route structure, it's evident. Those two black dotted lines show the average length of all the routes in their network pre and post introduction of the 500. The red bars show the percentage of their fleet consisting of 500 and subsequent generations of the 737. right? Correlation is never causality, but this is correlation that I think that warrants our attention. So the argument here is that disruption is a very particular way of delivering the kind of innovation we want, right? We want more for less. That's what we need. The best way to get it, I assert, is via disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation consists of three things. First of all, it's about focusing on a marginal segment, right? A small or unprofitable segment in the eyes of the leading incumbents. So where was Southwest focused? A small triangle of routes, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, with no real prospects for growth. And so as a consequence, the major airlines were not about to reinvent their business in order to defend those three routes. It just wasn't worth it, right? So a marginal segment in your sights. Second, build a fundamentally different business model that is optimized for the needs of that segment. Don't build something that's targeted at taking over the whole world. Build something that's targeted at delivering precisely the solution that that marginal segment wants, and build a solution that allows you to do it profitably. Remember, Southwest, when it wasn't growing, fabulously profitable. They knew they had a model that made it possible for them to be economically viable, even though they were focused on a small and, relatively speaking, unattractive segment of the market. And finally, this is the kicker, an enabling technology. This comes back to some of the comments that we heard this morning. What Southwest needed was its own metaphorical, if you will, intel inside that allowed them to serve ever more demanding segments of the market without, and this is crucial, without having to change their business model. Southwest could have started flying from New York to LA in 1975 if they'd wanted to buy an L-1011, but that would have corrupted their fundamentally different business model, so that simply didn't make any sense. Right? Those three ingredients: marginal segment, new business model, enabling technology. So cell phones, automobiles, and planes. When are we going to talk about something a little closer to home? Well, one last example outside of healthcare before I venture into the lion's den, but at least it does start to speak to some issues in the public sector. Market segmentation is the thing that I'd like to focus on this morning as the most important prerequisite for disruption, and I think it's the thing that policy and government has the greatest degree of control over when it comes to enabling, creating the kinds of conditions that are favorable to disruptive innovation. The U.S., I think, has the largest percentage of its population behind bars of any country on Earth. It's something in the neighborhood, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, so don't quote me, but they're close enough, close enough. I mean, 2 to 3 million people, I think, are behind bars at any given time. It is an astonishing number. The state of California spends more on its correctional system than it does on its university system. And a lot of that is driven by the belief that somehow anytime anybody's a criminal, we need to be maximally protected from anyone who demonstrates criminal behavior. And so a lot of people end up behind bars, even when they're not necessarily dangerous. What's started to happen is they're starting to use things like passive monitoring devices, right? So this is the ankle bracelets. And what passive monitoring does is, on occasion, it sends out it gets pinged and you're told where the person wearing this bracelet happens to be. And so this is a way to try and get people who aren't dangerous out of prison but still control their movements. But the technology gets better. You can go from passive monitoring to active monitoring, where you continually know where these people are. And from active monitoring, you can even beginning to move on to behavioral monitoring, which means that it can keep track of whether or not a particular person wearing this bracelet has been consuming alcohol or drugs or anything else like that you want to control their behavior. So you get to the point where this technology is fundamentally able to do almost all of the things that putting people behind bars can do, but it can do it for $7 a day instead of $100 a day. Now, the only way this can happen is if there is an acceptance of the fact that there are different, if you'll forgive the extension of the metaphor, an ability to address the needs of a different segment of the market. Not maximum. You don't start with monitoring technologies and try and control maximum security prisoners. You start with people who have far less dangerous offenses and are far less likely to offend in the future. And there are all sorts of other benefits, right? A lot of the people who end up behind bars were in fact the sole wage earners for their families, and so all of a sudden the children are thrown into a state of, it's a real catastrophe. And the argument here is that the political challenge is somehow to make it clear to people that it's okay to use technology to do things that we think only iron bars can do. And the way to get there is to start with the least demanding segment of the market, build a model optimized for that market, and then allow the technology to improve in ways that allow you to do harder things within the context of the same market. It requires an ability to segment and a willingness to be patient and a willing to let technology drive the rate and nature of improvement. So now an example from medical devices. This is the frontier, conceptually speaking, for anesthesiologists administering propofol. Propofol, a very popular sedative, of course. of late for all the wrong reasons, I'm afraid. But this is something that Johnson & Johnson created, the Sedasis Automated Sedation System. And Sedasis is intended to automate the delivery of propofol, because propofol is a very effective sedative, but it's something that, according to its label, requires an anesthesiologist or an anesthesia professional to, in fact, administer the drug. So J&J created Sedasis, and Sedasis is intended to do this automatically. Now, they made the very deliberate choice of not trying to create a device that was as good as an anesthesiologist right out of the box, because that's really hard to do. So instead what they did is they created a device that was good enough for a very narrow range of applications, specifically things like colonoscopies, right? So all of a sudden you've got a procedure that in some jurisdictions is not even done with anesthesia. And if anything happens to go sideways, any contraindications, patients' vitals go outside of very narrow and tightly described boundaries, well, then you can simply arrest the administration of the drug, you can terminate, you can end the procedure, or for that matter, given that it's a colonoscopy, you can probably just continue the procedure if you wanted to, right? That's a call that the clinician would be able to make. Now, the question becomes, how is the frontier of the anesthesiologist-administered propofol going to expand over time? Well, the only thing that allows that to get better, right, that allows us to get more for less from an anesthesiologist delivering propofol is if they're able to learn more and are willing to get paid less. So I don't really like their chances. But when you think about Sedasis over time, how does it get better? Well, it's waiting for its hardware to get cheaper and more capable. What are the chances of that, do you think? That's a slam dunk, isn't it? I mean, basically, their base station is a personal computer. Those things get cheaper by the month. You think about their software. As they learn more and as this is used in more and more applications, their algorithms for the administration of the drug will improve, and their treatment algorithms will allow them to address not only a wider range of contraindications, but also a wider range of procedures over time. This, in my book, literally, is a textbook case of deliberate disruption, a willingness to segment a market, develop a solution targeted at a less attractive segment within that market, and then allow technological improvements over time to allow that radically lower cost business model to address ever more demanding tiers. So the implications for government policy, and here I really am taking a step farther away from my area of expertise, so I say this with due circumspection, but there are kind of two ways that I've seen people think about the impact of regulation on innovation. There are people who will tell you that it's just a really bad idea, right? That the more regulation there is, the worse off we are when it comes to innovation. And they'll point to the fact that over the last 20, 30 years, there's been less and less economic regulation and a higher degree of innovation in various economic spheres as a consequence, not least the airline industry. I'm going to call this the get out of the way view, right? There's people who say, look, you just need to get out of the way and let the market deal with the various problems we face. But there's another possibility, right? Which is that it's not so much about getting out of the way as it is creating the right sorts of constraints that will drive innovation over time. Call this the Porter hypothesis. Porter had done a series of papers back in the early 90s talking about the need for things like environmental regulation in order to spur companies to find ways to reduce the output of waste product, frankly. Because markets, for all their benefits, are often inefficient. So what I'd like to suggest is that when we think about the kinds of policies that can drive innovation, my hope is in the conversation part of this session we can pick up on some of this, the trick is to encourage segmentation. And some of what John Hammergren was talking about pointed to things like group purchasing organizations actually stifling innovation because it makes segmentation more difficult. I think that very often when it comes to regulation, we fall into the same trap. In the US, for example, they're having challenges in their insurance markets because the insurance regulator is setting the bar simply far too high, not allowing different business models targeted at different segments to evolve so that one of them can potentially disrupt over time as a result of technological improvement. Second, define the critical constraints. When it comes to defining the markets, right? Markets are not naturally occurring phenomena. They are created by the body politic. And so if we define markets in a way that innovation targets the constraints that we most want to see relaxed, well, then chances are we're increasing our likelihood of actually breaking them over time. And finally, incrementalism is just fine, right? Southwest took 30 years to disrupt the US airline industry, but it happened. It would have been nice if it happened faster, but it didn't. The fact is that at least it happened. And the only reason it happened is because the market, and indeed the people who ran Southwest, were quite happy to build a point solution that was economically viable and simply wait until the technology came along that allowed them to grow, rather than pursuing growth for its own sake and in the process corrupting and fundamentally destroying their opportunity for long-run disruptive innovation.